Hello students, this is the May June 2024 Economics Paper 1 discussion. This is the MCQ paper. Let us now proceed on to discussing the questions and their answers. Question number 1. Why will scarcity always exist? The options given are: there are high costs of production, there are low levels of education, there are unlimited resources, there are unlimited wants. Now, the easy way to approach this question is to remind yourself the definition for the term scarcity. Scarcity refers to the relative concept that represents the unlimited nature of human wants in comparison to the limited nature of economic resources. So, in short, we say scarcity exists because we have limited economic resources and unlimited wants. Now, you need to look for these two options in your answers: limited economic resources, unlimited wants. So we have unlimited resources as option C, which is not the answer because it has to be limited resources. And then we have unlimited wants in D, which would be the correct option. So the answer that we get for question number 1 would be D. Question 2. A student decides to take up a 2-year apprenticeship for which she will earn $10,000 per year. After that, she expects to earn $25,000 per year. She could take an unskilled job which pays $16,000 per year instead of the apprenticeship. What is the opportunity cost in the 2 years of completing the apprenticeship? Now, this question you need to identify that the student has two options. One option is to complete a 2-year apprenticeship period. Option 2 is to take up an unskilled job. The question that is being asked from you is the opportunity cost of doing the apprenticeship. In other words, when the student selected the apprenticeship, what did she forego? So let's see. If she selected the apprenticeship, the option that she forewent would have been the unskilled job. So if she had taken up the unskilled job, the job would have paid her $16,000 per year. Now let's go on to a little bit of a calculation. So had the student decided to go ahead with the apprenticeship, she would have earned $10,000 per year. So within the 2-year period, she would have earned $20,000. However, had she engaged in the unskilled job, she would have been paid $16,000 per year. That is a total of $30,000 for 2 years. So now they are asking us the opportunity cost of selecting the apprenticeship. So if we selected the apprenticeship, we would have foregone the unskilled job, and that means we would have foregone the revenue we would have earned by the unskilled job. However, our opportunity cost is not $32,000 because by engaging in the apprenticeship, we did earn $20,000. So in order to calculate the amount that we forewent from $32,000, we need to deduct what we actually achieved, that is the $20,000 from the apprenticeship. So 32,000 minus 20,000, we will be left with $12,000. So we had to sacrifice $12,000 because we engaged in the apprenticeship. So now we need to look for $12,000 in our options. So accordingly, we could see that answer B provides us the correct answer for $12,000. Question 3. The diagram shows a country's production possibility curve or PPC. The question is, which current combination of capital and consumer goods would produce the greatest number of consumer goods in the future? Now, one thing you need to remember with regards to consumer and capital goods is if a country produces more consumer goods in the short run, they will not be able to consume that many consumer goods in the long run. However, if a country engages in producing more capital goods, that is machinery and equipment in the short run, they could actually enjoy more consumer goods in the long run. This is because the capital equipment is used to manufacture consumer goods. So now here, if you take a look at points such as R and S, you will see that there is less capital goods produced. Similarly, point U and V also has less capital goods produced. So option C and D are not the correct answers. When we consider option A, O and Q, that represents zero capital goods and 100% consumer goods, which again is not the answer. So therefore, our answer will be answer B, where it's P and O, zero consumer goods in the short run, but in the long run, there will be more consumer goods because today they are investing in producing capital goods. Then we move on to question 4, what is not a macroeconomic topic? So we know we have microeconomics that deals with decisions made by households and firms. And then we have macroeconomics regarding decisions made by governments and the international trade sector. So option A, growth in the Chinese gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is a macroeconomic topic. So therefore, that is not the answer. They're asking what is not a macroeconomic topic. Option B, the level of consumer price index inflation in the UK. So inflation is a macroeconomic topic. So that is also not the answer. The level of unemployment in Spain. Unemployment levels are regarding macroeconomics. So it's not the answer. Finally, the total output of the German car industry. Here, this is not a macroeconomic topic because it is related to the car industry and nothing to do with the entire economy as a whole. So therefore, the correct answer for question number 4 would be answer D. Question 5. What is likely to cause an extension in demand for a firm's fruit drink? Option A, a period of hot weather. B, a reduction in the cost of producing the drink. C, a rival firm leaving the market. D, a successful advertising campaign by the firm. Before we proceed on to finding the accurate answer, let's explore the meaning of the term extension. An extension in demand occurs as a result of a change in the price of the product. And as a result of this, there shall be a movement of a point along the same demand curve, and there shall be no shift. So in this instance, the demand and supply would represent the fruit drinks demand and supply. And if there's going to be an extension in demand, there's going to be a movement along the demand curve for this fruit drink. And remember, there is not going to be a shift. Now, what we have to do is we have to select the correct option that represents a movement of a point and not a shift. So let's take a look at option A, a period of hot weather. Now, hot weather we know comes under a factor affecting demand, but then it isn't the price. Then we have a reduction in the cost of producing the drink. Now, this may initially seem as a factor affecting the supply because cost of production is a factor affecting supply and therefore seem irrelevant. And then option C, a rival firm leaving the market. So when a rival leaves the market, that would actually increase the demand for your product and thereby shift the demand curve to the right. But here we are not looking for a shift, we are looking for a movement of a point. D, a successful advertising campaign by the firm. This is also not the price. So that also does not result in a movement of a point. Instead, it will result in a shift. That leaves us with option B, in fact. And that's because when the cost of producing the drink falls, sellers are able to reduce the selling price. And as a result of the price falling, the quantity demand for fruit drinks shall increase. So there you see, it's as a result of the selling price, because cost of production is directly related to the selling price. So the correct answer would be option D. And then we move on to question 6. Supermarkets sell petrol, that's gas, outside their stores. They reduce the price of petrol below other suppliers to attract more customers to buy goods in the store when they buy more petrol. If this was successful, how might it be shown on demand and supply diagrams? So here we need to take a look at the demand and supply diagram for petrol separately and the demand and supply diagram for the goods separately. So now you can see I've drawn two equilibrium diagrams in this particular slide. So the one on the left is what we shall be using to represent the changes for petroleum. So now let's go to the data and read about what happened to petroleum. Supermarkets sell petrol gas outside their stores. They reduce the price of petrol below other suppliers to attract more customers to buy goods. So they reduce the price. Ideally, when the price falls, it can affect both the demand as well as the supply of the product. But if you take a look at the options available, option A to D here in the first column, none of them mention anything about a movement of a point. Now that gives us a clue that we need to look at another factor that will affect the demand or the supply. So the first one, option A, is shift of the demand curve to the left. So when petroleum is provided at a lower price, it's not going to create a shift because it's the price. Shift of the demand curve to the right. Again, demand curve is not going to shift because it is the price. Shift of the supply curve to the left and shift of the supply curve to the right. So now you see there is no movement of a point. And that should give you a clue as to there's something else that the examiner is trying to mention. They reduce the price of petrol below other suppliers to attract more customers to buy goods. So they are actually reducing the price than all of the other suppliers. And when the price falls, generally, it will also affect the supply. So now, since the demand angle does not seem to work, we can pay attention to the supply side. So we are now going to change the perspective from which we are approaching the question. Now, as a result of the prices of petroleum coming down, and in order to increase the sale of the particular items in the stall, these petroleum selling firms would want to make petroleum more available. And therefore, it'll increase the supply of petroleum in the country because they are now making petroleum more available at a lower price. And that may shift the supply curve. And when you shift the supply curve, because there's an increase in the supply of petroleum now, it'll shift to the right. So we shall be shifting the supply curve to the right. We get the supply curve, that's the blue color one. We're drawing a new supply curve to the right of it. There'll be a shift to the right. Now let's take a look at the other one. Demand and supply diagram for the store's goods. So now when petroleum becomes less costly and it's more available, more customers would want to come and visit the place. And the whole purpose of them having this strategy is to attract more customers to the store. And yes, presuming that it works, because they have mentioned if this was successful, there would actually be more people coming into the store and purchasing goods. And that would affect the demand. So here we need the supply curve to shift to the right, and then it will increase the demand. So shift of the demand curve to the right. So we'll have more demand for our products in the store. So our demand curve would shift outward. The option that shows demand curve shifting outwards, that's this. And the supply curve shifting outwards is this. So our correct answer would be option D. Just to check with the question. Question 7. Which statement describes a market in disequilibrium? So first, let's discuss what is meant by the term disequilibrium. Now, as we know, equilibrium refers to a situation where the free market forces of demand and supply are at a balance. Accordingly, a disequilibrium would suggest where the free market forces of demand and supply are not at a balance. Now, here we are expected to identify the statement that refers to disequilibrium. Option A, excess demand results from a government maximum price below the equilibrium price. Excess demand is a situation where the demand exceeds the supply. And yes, it would exist in a situation where the government sets the maximum price, which is generally set below the equilibrium price level. And also, whenever there is an excess demand, there is no equilibrium. Hence, there will be a disequilibrium if there was excess demand. Option B, the point where the demand and supply curves cross. So the point where demand and supply curves meet or intersect is generally identified as equilibrium. But our question is about disequilibrium. Option C, price changes cause further changes in both demand and supply. Yes, as a result of a change in the price, the demand as well as the supply could change, resulting in a new equilibrium or in a disequilibrium situation. D, the quantity demanded by consumers equal the quantity supplied by producers. Now, if option D is correct, that would go to an equilibrium because quantity demanded, QD, is equals to QS. Demanders and suppliers are at a balance. That would only occur at an equilibrium situation. So option B and option D are out as the question requests about this equilibrium. Hence, you have to select between option A and C. Option A talks about an excess demand situation ideally occurring whenever there's a disequilibrium. Option C, there is a possibility of a disequilibrium. However, the point that has the most clear and apparent market disequilibrium would be option A. However, the marking criteria suggests option B, which may mean that there is a typographical error, and question 7 requires equilibrium situation rather than a disequilibrium situation. However, if it is disequilibrium, the answer is A. Question 8. In response to an increase in price from $5 per kilogram to $6 per kilogram, a farmer increased supply from 400 kilograms to 500 kilograms per week. What is the price elasticity of supply? So we have the formula to calculate price elasticity of supply, which is percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. So let's take a look at how the calculation would be done. So percentage change in quantity supplied is 100 divided by 400 into 100 because quantity supplied changes from 400 to 500, the difference being 100, divided by the original value of 400, multiplied by 100 in order to gain the percentage. The percentage change in price. The difference between the price is $5 to $6. The difference is $1 divided by the original price of $5 multiplied by 100 to obtain a percentage. So PES would be 25 divided by 20, which is equal to 1.25. So 1.25 would amount to question or answer D. So that's the correct answer for this question. Question 9. Which government measure is most likely to cause a fall both in price and in quantity traded? So the government measures are provided: indirect tax, maximum price, minimum price, and subsidy. So for the ease of understanding, I have provided diagrams here. Let's take a look at what these diagrams denote. Option A is an indirect tax. Now we know an indirect tax is imposed on a supplier, and as a result of the indirect tax, suppliers are discouraged. Accordingly, the first diagram here that you will see here represents an inward shift in the supply curve. So as a result of the inward shift in the supply curve, we generally do not have a fall in the price. We will always experience an increase in the price. So accordingly, option A would not be the correct answer. Then the opposite of indirect tax, we have option D, which is a subsidy. So when a subsidy is being imposed on suppliers, what happens is they are encouraged. Accordingly, the supply curve would shift to the right. So that's what you see in the fourth diagram here. So there would be a decline in the price. However, with regard to the quantity, there would be an increase in the quantity and not a decline. So option D is also not the correct answer. Now we are left with option B and option C. So if we take a look at option B, which is the maximum price, maximum prices are generally set below the equilibrium price. So when it is set below the equilibrium price, it results in a fall in the price. And when a maximum price is set up below the equilibrium price, you will see it creates an excess demand situation. As a result of the excess demand situation, you will see that the quantity demand is higher, whereas the quantity supplied falls. So this pretty much answers the criteria of the question. However, let us also take a look at minimum price controls. Minimum price controls have the price above the equilibrium price. So since the price is now above the old price, which is the equilibrium price, that does not result in a fall in the price. So therefore, the correct answer for question number 9 would be maximum price control, answer B. Now let's take a look at question 10. The diagrams show the wage rates of cleaners, OWC, and nurses, OWN. So we have the first diagram for cleaners, the second diagram for nurses. The question is, what is the result if a national minimum wage of OM is introduced? So let us take a look at each of the diagrams. The first diagram for cleaners show equilibrium where the demand and the supply curves meet at WC. Now, when OM is introduced, that is the national minimum wage, it will ensure that the wage rate of cleaners increase because M is above the WC level. So there's an increase in the wage rate of cleaners. If you look at the second diagram of nurses, the equilibrium level where demand and supply meet is at WN. Accordingly, when OM is being imposed, that national minimum wage level is actually beneath the equilibrium level for nurses. Now let's take a look at the options available and select the correct answer. So that we have wage rates of cleaners. So we need to decide what happened to the wage rates of cleaners as a result of the national minimum wage of OM being introduced. So we looked at the first diagram. The equilibrium was at WC. When OM was introduced, the national minimum wage or the wage rate of the cleaners increased. So option A says fall, option B no change, option C and D says rise. So our answer should be either option C or D because there was a rise in the wage rate of cleaners. On the other hand, we see for nurses, equilibrium was at WN. When OM was reduced, actually the wage rate was beneath, that is, the national minimum wage rate was beneath the equilibrium rate. Now, what we mean by the term national minimum wage rate is the least amount that you can pay a worker. That doesn't mean you can't pay a worker above that. So, in the case of nurses, they are being paid above the national minimum wage. So, when they are being paid above the national minimum wage, their salary does not come down, it remains the same. So the correct answer that we have for this particular question is answer D, where there is a rise in the wage rate of cleaners and there is no change in the wage rate of nurses. Question 11. What could cause a decrease in spending by households in a country? Households generally engage in spending for three different purposes. They engage in spending to purchase the day-to-day consumable items, for emergency instances, and for investment. So here they're asking us what would cause a decrease, a drop in the spending. Option A, a reduction in the disposable income. Disposable income would be the income that individuals get to their hands after deduction of direct taxes from their salary. B, reduction in the rate of sales tax. That is something like a reduction in the VAT or the value added tax, which would actually increase their capability of purchasing goods and services and thereby increase the demand for them. Lowering interest rates. As interest rates lower, households would not save. Accordingly, they would utilize that money to purchase goods and services, thereby increasing the demand for goods and services, so increasing the spending. D, lower savings. As a result of lower levels of savings, consumers would not be able to purchase many goods and services, thereby decreasing spending. Hence, the answer to this question is A, because as a result of a reduction in the disposable income or the income they get to their hand after the deduction of the tax, if that amount is low, then they would have less money to spend on goods and services, thereby decreasing the spending of households. Moving on to question 12. Which combination shows the advantages of a small firm over a large firm? So here we need to consider the features of a small firm, advantages, positive features of a small firm in relation to better communication, greater independence, and lower average costs. So when considering a small firm, they actually do have better communication as they get an opportunity to have a one-on-one discussion with the customers. Hence, it should be a yes. So option C or D. Greater independence. They operate on their own, do not have to obtain instructions from others. Yes. So we get 3 yeses here. And then finally, low average cost. This, of course, would be a no because only a large firm would be able to enjoy economies of scale. Whereas small firms that purchase in smaller quantities do not get things like purchasing economies. Hence, their average cost would be considerably higher. So it would be a no or a no. So ideally, the answer which gets all three options would be answer C. So question number 12, the answer would be C. Question 13. What is a variable cost for a firm? We have the options: the cost of raw materials, the interest payment on existing loans, the rent on the factory, the insurance on the factory buildings. Now, before we go through each of the options, the easy way is to first think about the definition for the term variable cost. So we know variable cost refers to the costs that change with the level of output. And these variable costs generally include the costs on raw materials, the cost on direct labor, and any other direct costs that are directly related to the output. So now, when you think about the definition, you actually have got your answer. Variable costs are the costs on the raw materials because they are not the interest on loans, not the rent on a factory because rent is an overhead. Insurance on factory buildings is also an overhead cost. It is not dependent on the number of output. Hence, the answer for question 13 is answer A, the cost of raw materials. Then we move on to question 14. The table shows the daily average revenue and units of output sold for a firm producing bicycles over a 5-day period. So we have the 5 days, day 1 to day 5, the average revenue, that is the income earned by selling one item or the selling price of one item, and the units of output sold per day. Question: what can be concluded from the table? So when you look at the table, what data can you conclude? Option A, the firm's highest total revenue occurs at 2 units of output sold. So here, when 2 units of output are sold, that is on day 1, they earn an average revenue of 200. Bear in mind, average revenue is the income per item, but the option is asking us highest total revenue. So average revenue is the revenue per item. So if you're selling 2 items, average revenue would be 200 into 2, which is 400. That is your total revenue. So you need to calculate the total revenue of all of these output in order to identify which is the highest total revenue. Option B, the firm's highest total revenue occurs at 14 units of output sold. So 14 units of output is on the fourth day, where they sell 14 units at an average revenue of $80. Similarly, there too, if you go ahead and calculate the total revenue for all of these output, you will be able to compare which one has the highest level of total revenue, which day has or which quantity has the lowest level of revenue. Option C, the firm's prices are always greater than total revenue. So we have average revenue is 200, 160, 120, 80, 40. That is the selling price or the average revenue. Total revenue is obtained by multiplying the average revenue by the number of units. So therefore, you will never have prices greater than the total revenue because the total revenue will always be greater than the price. So option C is out. Option D, the firm's total revenue always increases as output increases. Well, ideally speaking, total revenue should increase as the output increases. But then that's left for argument because you will have to do the calculation here. So once you do the total revenue calculation, you shall be able to identify whether that is also true. So depending on the data, what you could see is the correct answer is B. The firm's highest total revenue occurs at 14 units of output because at 14 units of output, it is 14 multiplied by 80. So that gives you the total revenue there. So if you did the total revenue calculation, you would see that option B is the correct answer. Question 15. Which function of money acts as a measure of value? So we know measure of value is a function of money that allows money to calculate the value of any product or service. So now let's take a look at the options. Option A, medium of exchange. This allows money to engage in any transaction. B, a standard of deferred payment. This allows money to make payments in the future for something that we have purchased today. Store of wealth, an individual could actually convert their assets into cash and store it for future purposes. Unit of account, it could give accounting values to any product or service. So the answer to this particular question would be option D, because unit of account is what shows us that any product or service could be valued in terms of money. Question 16. What are the features of a highly competitive market when compared with a monopoly market? Here they're actually asking you to compare between a perfectly competitive situation with a monopoly market. In a perfect competition market, we know there are a large number of sellers and a large number of buyers, and they are price takers since they can't control the selling price. On the other hand, we have a monopoly market where one single firm controls the market. They set prices, hence they are price makers. Now here we are expected to talk about the features of a highly competitive market, meaning we are looking at the features of a perfect competition market situation. The factors we have to consider are price and profits. So in a highly competitive market or in a perfectly competitive market situation, price is generally low as all firms are selling identical products. They cannot charge very high prices. Prices are considerably low when you compare it with a monopoly. And then when it comes to profits, in comparison to a monopoly, the profits are also low because in a monopoly, one firm controls the market and they can charge high prices and enjoy the entire profit. But in a perfectly competitive situation, large number of small firms. So therefore, they have normal profits and hence very little profits. So the answer to this question would be low levels of prices and low levels of profit. Hence the answer would be D. Question 17. What is not a role of central government in a mixed economy? A. Providing demerit goods. B. Providing merit goods. C. Providing public goods. D. Stabilizing the economy. The question is, what is not a role of the central government in a mixed economy? So in a mixed economy, we do have both the private as well as public sectors involved. However, the question here they're asking is not something that the public sector does. So there will be obviously one answer which shows something that the public sector does not do, but everything else the public sector does. So let's take a look at the options. Option A, providing demerit goods. Demerit goods like cigarettes and alcohol. It's questionable whether a government will provide these things. Option B, providing merit goods like free education and healthcare. That definitely the government does it. So the question is asking not a role of the government, but providing merit goods is a role of the government. So that can't be the correct answer for this question. C, providing public goods. We pretty well know that public goods like transportation, roadways are provided by the government. So it is a role of the government, whereas the question is asking not a role of the government. So C is also not the correct answer. D, stabilizing the economy, making sure the economy runs stably. Like, for example, that there is stable inflation levels and rates. And that again tends to be a responsibility of the government. So we can't say that it is not a role. So B, C, D options are out, which leaves us with option A, providing demerit goods. So providing demerit goods that are harmful, overproduced, and overconsumed, such as alcohol and tobacco, is not the responsibility of the government. Government does not have to provide these things because they are not essential for the survival of the people. So the correct answer here would be answer A. Moving on to question 18, a government wishes to prevent deflation. Now, deflation is the continuous fall in the price level of goods and services. So the government wants to prevent a continuous fall. Which combination of policies would be the most effective in achieving this aim? So what should be done to the interest rate? What should be done to the government spending in order to prevent deflation? Now remember, preventing deflation means that to stop the price levels falling. In short, we are looking at the exact opposite. You have to make sure the price levels rise. So what should we do to the interest rate in order to make sure that the price levels increase? So for instance, should we increase the interest rate? If the government increases the interest rate, it would actually discourage borrowings by firms because it's expensive now. So if it discourages the borrowing, firms wouldn't invest. And when firms don't invest, there's not going to be a demand for factors of production. So it's actually going to reduce the demand and worsen deflation. So option A can't be the correct answer. And because interest rates increasing is not the answer, we can safely rule out option B as well. That leaves us with option C or D, because C and D state that interest rates have to decrease. So for instance, if the interest rate decreases, firms are now encouraged to obtain loans, and therefore they will depend on purchasing factors of production to produce the product, and accordingly, when there's an increase in the demand for those raw materials, selling price will increase. And then let's take a look at the government spending column. What should the government do to prevent deflation to government spending? Should they increase government spending to reduce deflation, or should they increase government spending to reduce deflation? So if your ultimate objective is to reduce deflation, in other words, you want to make sure there is inflation, then you need to find a way to increase government spending. Because if the government spends more, maybe building infrastructure or maybe providing subsidies and unemployment benefits to the people, it will make sure that their disposable income increases. Thereby, they will increase the aggregate demand for goods and services. So when the demand for goods and services increase, you will be able to overcome deflationary pressures. So now, let's find the final answer. We need to have a reduction in the interest rates so that borrowing can be cheaper and firms will be able to borrow. On the other hand, we will need the government spending to increase so that there will be more purchasing power, and then people will buy goods and services, thereby increasing the prices and preventing deflation. So the correct answer to this would be answer C, reducing the interest rate and increasing the government spending. Question 19. The diagram shows the impact of a tax introduced on a product. So we can see the diagram, the price, the quantity axis, demand curve, supply curve at S1, and the supply curve has shifted to the left to S2, resulting in the creation of a new equilibrium at E. And if we are to identify the area of the tax or the tax incidence, we shall have to start off from the new equilibrium and then move on until we reach the original curve. And This would be the entire tax incidence. However, our question is, which area represents the amount of tax paid by the consumer? That's the consumer bond tax. Consumer bond tax is the difference between the old equilibrium price and the new equilibrium price. So hence, the old equilibrium price would be P1. So we have that line. And then P2 would be the new equilibrium. Accordingly, the consumer bond tax would be this top area that is being shaded. This top area would be P1, P2, E, and F. This rectangle, P1, P2, E, F. So we get P1, P2, E, and F as option D. Option D is the correct answer. Question 20. Which statement about supply side policy is correct? Let's have a quick recap about what supply side policies are. These are methods used by the government to increase the aggregate supply or the total supply of the economy. Now let's take a look at the options. Option A, it aims to increase the productive potential of the economy. Productive potential refers to the possible output that an economy can produce at a given point of time. So in option A, they are referring to an increase in that production potential. Option B, it aims to increase the total demand in the economy. Supply side policies generally do not focus on demand. Hence, option B is not the answer. C, it involves changes in the equilibrium foreign exchange rate. Foreign exchange rate is also a demand side instrument. Hence, wouldn't support in supply side policies. D, it involves changes in the rate of interest. Rate of interests are also related to demand side. Hence, that is also out. Leaving us with option A as the correct answer, because increasing the production potential or the output levels of the economy would relate to the number of items produced, which is a supply side policy. Moving on to question 21. Which change is most likely to cause faster economic growth in the short run? Faster economic growth refers to an increasing level of GDP, that is, more output being produced in the country. Option A, an increase in net emigration. Net emigration would mean the number of people leaving the country. So an increase in net emigration is a high number of individuals leaving the country. Option B, an increase in the birth rate. This would, yes, increase economic growth, but it would be in the very long term because it would need a certain time period for these newborn children to grow up, be skilled, and then join the labor force. So it's not going to be the fastest method of gaining economic growth. C, an increase in the death rate. Increase in the death rate would actually reduce the economic growth rate as it reduces the output level of the economy. D, an increase in the retirement age. Now, this ensures that the aged workforce continues to manufacture goods in the economy. This could indeed increase more output and thereby increase economic growth. But our question would be whether this is the fastest. So now we are left with option A and D. Option A, an increase in the net emigration. So if the labor force of the country goes abroad in order to engage in professions and jobs where they can earn money and send the money back to the country, whether that would increase the fastest economic growth or whether increasing the retirement age so that people would be able to work for longer until they are much older, lead to faster economic growth? The answer for this particular question would be option A. The reason for this is option D also appears to be correct. However, option D would not be the fastest, as um, older populations, they tend to take a longer time period to carry out the production. And also, since due to their bad health conditions, it might slow down the economic growth rate. However, the net emigration increasing is going to contribute to a faster economic growth, as generally it is the young adult labor force that goes abroad in search of jobs. So option A is the correct answer for this question. Question 22. How is the pattern of employment likely to change when a country becomes more developed? A, from rural employment to urban employment. B, from skilled employment to primary employment. C, from technical employment to manual employment. D, from tertiary employment to secondary employment. So now here you're supposed to consider how employment changes as a country becomes more developed. In short, when a country goes from a developing status to a developed status, what type of changes in employment could we see? So, generally speaking, what we see is most developing countries rely on agricultural types of production. So, therefore, when they move on to being developed nations, they turn out to be mostly contributing to the tertiary sector. So, there can be employment and unemployment changes based on that. And also with development, what happens is there's infrastructure development, job opportunities created. As a result of that, you could see most individuals from the village areas coming and migrating to the cities or towns. So that's another pattern that you could see. Now, depending on that data, I guess it would be easier for you to find the answer now. So since I said when a country moves from developing to developed, they would go from more of an agricultural based economy to a service sector based economy. We can safely remove option D because option D says from tertiary to secondary. Whereas as a country develops, it will go from second agricultural, that is primary, to secondary, then secondary to tertiary. So that is out. Then we have C, technical employment to manual employment. That is highly unlikely because as the country develops, they would invest more in technology. So it would rather move with the opposite direction, manual to technical. And then skilled employment to primary employment. That again is quite unlikely because as the country develops, mostly they would go ahead with primary sector in employment and then move on to more skilled and professional sectors. That leaves us with option A, from rural employment to urban employment, which is correct. Because as I said, when a country develops, people would move from the villages or from rural areas into cities and towns. So the employment structure would change from people being employed in rural areas to now being employed in urban areas. So the answer for question number 22 would be A. Then we move on to question 23. Which item is least likely to be included in the Consumer Prices Index, the CPI? So now we know the CPI is a measure used to calculate the inflation level in an economy. So when calculating the inflation level in an economy, we always consider a selected basket of goods. And then we observe the changes in prices and the changes in the percentage of consumer income spent on these products in the basket. So if we look at these products here, they have given us domestic cooking oil, homemade clothes, milk, and personal mobile phones. The question they are asking you is to find out the product that is least likely to be included in that basket of goods. So if we take domestic cooking oil, that's a very general product that people use, like every household uses it. So it's quite likely that this will be included, but they're asking us for something that may not be included or least likely to be included. And then we have homemade clothes. Well, clothing would be included. Whether it will be homemade clothing per se is up for debate. And milk. It's a necessary item, and hence it's definitely going to get included. Personal mobile phones. Yes, maybe personal mobile phones was not an essential item maybe around 2 decades ago. However, now it has become an essential commodity, and therefore people cannot do without it. However, since it still could be survived without to a greater extent, the options that we have are option B and D. So out of these, option B is the correct answer because homemade clothes. Generally, clothing, like I said, is important. However, the fact that it should be homemade is not an essential component. Hence, it is least likely to be included in the consumer price index. Question 24. The table shows statistics for 4 countries A, B, C, and D. According to the data provided, which country has the lowest standard of living? So now, when we measure the standard of living, one of the most common methods to do so is to use the Human Development Index, which we refer to as the HDI. When measuring the HDI, we take into account the real GDP per capita, which has been referred here as GDP per head. We also take into consideration the life expectancy at birth, which we see here, and the average school going year, which is also available here. Now, if a country has to have the lowest standard of living, then they should have a very low GDP per head, a low life expectancy at birth, and few years of schooling. So you need to look at these values and find the country with the lowest level on all. Ideally, we will easily find the answer, and the answer is option A, where the children only go to school for 6 years in comparison to 7, 9, and 12 in the other units. And the people live for the least number of years, which is 45. And the GDP per capita or GDP per head is also at the lowest level. So the correct answer is option A. Question 25. Economic development in country X has progressed at a greater rate than in country Y. What is the most likely explanation of this difference in economic development between country X and country Y? So we see country X has grown at a faster pace. We are supposed to pick the option showing us why country is growing at a faster pace than X. So if you take a look at country X, that's option A and B. Option A says country X has a higher level of spending on education than country Y. So whenever a country spends a lot on education, it results in a more skilled workforce in the future, and that may positively impact the healthcare conditions as well as the real income levels. So we could consider option A. Option B, country X has a higher level of unemployment than country Y. So having a high level of unemployment doesn't denote development. It's actually the opposite. So option B is out. Option C, country Y has a higher level of investment spending than country X. So if there's more investment in country Y, then country Y should be developing at a faster pace than country X. But then that's not true. So option C is also out. Option D, country Y has a higher level of spending on healthcare than country X. Here too, the factor focuses on country Y being better than country X, and that does not answer the question that we have at hand. Accordingly, the correct answer for this question will be option A. That's because when country X spends a lot of money on education, they'll get a skilled labor force, of course, in the future. However, skilled labor force can lead a country to develop, and that will lead to country X being better than country Y. Question 26. A rise in which factor would cause an increase in the population growth rate of a country? So, population growth rate, the proportion by which the population of a country is increasing. So, we need to find the option which shows an increasing rate of population. First one is the birth rate, that is the number of live births per thousand of the population. So you need to consider whether if there is an increase in the birth rate, whether it would cause an increase in the population growth rate. And then we have death rate. Death rate is the number of deaths per thousand of the population. So whenever the number of deaths in the population increase, does that increase the population growth rate? C, infant mortality rate is the number of infants dying. So there, if the infant mortality rate increases, does it cause an increase in the population growth rate? Net emigration as the number of individuals leaving the country. And then if that increases, does it increase the population growth rate of a country? So if you take net emigration, for instance, number of people leaving the country, the number of people leaving is high. Obviously, it's not going to increase the population growth. It's going to be a decline in the population. So it's not D. Then we have infant mortality rate. So the number of infants dying. So if more infants are dying, then obviously again, the population growth rate is not going to increase. Also, if death rate increases, meaning the number of deaths per thousand of the population rises, that would not also increase the population growth. Therefore, we are left with answer A, which is the number of births per thousand of the population increasing. Yes, that would increase the rate at which the population is growing. So our answer is A, increased births will increase the population growth rate. Then we move on to question 27. The diagram shows the market for an imported good with equilibrium at point X. So you can see point X here where the S curve and the D curve intersect. The country imposes a tariff on this good. Is the new equilibrium at point A, B, C, or D? So we have the original curves, S curve and the D curve, equilibrium at X. We have to identify the impact of a tariff. A tariff is a tax on an imported product. And we know when a tax is being imposed, it affects the supply curve. So accordingly, the supply curve will shift to the left because as a result of the tax, supplies are discouraged. So S the S curve here, which is the original supply curve, would shift leftward, meaning the new supply curve would be S1. Now, tariff does not impact the demand, therefore, the demand curve remains at D with no changes. So now our new equilibrium will be at the point where the new S1 curve intersects with the D curve, that is at the point B. So the answer is option B. Question 28. The diagram shows the market for the Chinese yuan priced in US dollars. So you can see a demand and supply diagram with two demand curves, D1 and D2, and the S1 curve. The question says, what could have caused the change in demand for the yuan from D1 to D2? Now, the first thing that we need to do here is to study the movement of. Question 29. The table shows the average exchange rate of the UK pound to the US dollar. That is the amount of dollars that can be bought with £1. The question is, what is a likely effect of this change on the UK economy? So we have the years 1 to 4, and then we have the exchange rate. So if you take a look at this, now they have informed us that the exchange rate is calculated how many US dollars could be purchased with one Great Britain pound. So when you look at the trend in the first year, one British pound equals $1.64. In the second year, it has come down to 1.52. In the third year, it comes down further to 1.35, and in the fourth year, it is only 1.25. So you can see you can buy lesser and lesser US dollars by using one British pound. Now, this is identified as a decreasing value in the Great Britain pound or a depreciation in the pound, whereas on the other hand, we can see an appreciation in the US dollar. So as a result, we need to find out what will be the impact on the economy. So now the points given here are decreased cost push inflation, decreased current account deficit, increased quantity of imports, and increased trade deficit. So out of these four options, we can directly rule out an increase in the trade deficit. Because when there is a depreciation, generally there will be an increase or boost in the export revenue of the economy because the export products appear to be cheaper. So when there is going to be more revenue from exports, that's not going to create a trade deficit. So we can rule out answer D. Then we can talk about the increased quantity of imports. Now here what has happened to the UK economy is the British pound has actually depreciated. So therefore, as a result of the depreciation, imports will be expensive to them. And therefore, there will not be an increase in imports. So answer C is also out. That leaves us with A and B. Now, A talks about a decrease in cost push inflation. That is, the factors of production should appear cheaper. So now, when the British pound depreciates, any land labor capital that they import is actually going to be costly to them. So therefore, there can't be a decrease in the cost on factors of production. So the answer is also not A. Instead, it is B because it decreases the current account deficit. So as a result of the British pound depreciating, their value of exports is going to increase. So the export revenue is going to increase. Accordingly, there's going to be a favorable impact on the current account. However, if the current account is already at a negative balance, then since it is affecting it favorably, the negative balance would reduce. So accordingly, a decrease in the current account deficit is the correct answer. Question 30. The table shows components of Japan's current account balance in trillion yen for 2 years. The question is, which balance improved between year 1 and year 2? So here you can take a look at the table that is being provided. Year 1 data as well as year 2 data has been provided. Now your task is to compare the balances between the 2 years and identify in which balance there has been an improvement. So we take a look at the balance of goods in trillion, which is the second column there. It has gone from minus 1.61 to minus 5.23. So there, ideally, there has been an increase in the deficit balance of goods account. And then the balance of services account has gone from minus 1.76 to minus 2.33, which again is an increase in the deficit. Thereafter, we come to the balance of primary income, where we see the primary income is positive in the first year, 14.04. In the second year, also it is positive. However, it has come down to 13.55. And the balance of secondary income, here we see it has gone from minus 1.11 in the first year to minus 1.02. So here in the balance of secondary income, you could see that yes, it is a negative balance in both years. However, the negativity or the negative balance has reduced when it comes to the second year. Because in the first year, it is minus 1.11. However, in the second year, it's lesser. It shows minus 1.02. So therefore, the answer would be balance of secondary income. So let's take a look at which option gives us that answer. Let's answer C. The deficit on the secondary income account has declined by 0.09. So that is the correct answer. And on that note, that brings us to the end of this particular paper's discussion.